program, we discussed the alignment of the planets. In fact, the Sky and Telescope magazine in the May 2000 edition discussed when planets align. And this month is definitely an interesting one because this grouping of the planets is occurring in the constellation Taurus, at the entering in. And so, since Taurus refers to the day of the Lord and the beginning of the judgment, we're going to call this program Entering into Judgment. Gary Stearman is here to discuss this fascinating subject.
And a fascinating subject it is, J.R. We're talking about the stars, the gospel in the stars, the topic that was introduced by Joseph Seiss in the last century. And Taurus is the mythical beast called Ram, translated unicorn, in the King James Bible. But every place you see this idea of the unicorn, the expression is that of the celestial sign of Taurus, now called the bull, standing for judgment. And as we pointed out in our last broadcast, as the sun enters into Taurus and moves through the signs called in the Hebrew Mazarot, called in modern days the Zodiac, as the sun moves through Taurus and then on, it's really moving into an area that typifies judgment. Well, that's our general subject, and we're answering the question, what about the May 2000 alignment of the planets? Is there any significance? That's the question we're dealing with.
Now here's a fascinating side note. This same constellation, Taurus, welcomed an alignment of the planets, or a grouping of the planets, in the same month of May in the year 1941, 59 years ago. And you remember what happened in December 1941? Pearl Harbor.
Yes, indeed.
And, of course, we have World War II. When the United States got involved in this war, it became a worldwide war. 1941 was the year, and it's kind of interesting, Gary, that 5 planets were grouped together in the same constellation at the entering in of Taurus. It's almost like God's giving 2 witnesses here that the judgment of the day of the Lord is beginning.
Well, you know, J.R., many people have spoken of World War II as a preview of the tribulation. If you recall, there were a lot of people at the time of World War II who were calling Hitler the Antichrist, and they were saying this is the judgment.
And look at the death of the Jews. Yes. In the Holocaust. 6 million Jews died in World War II. It was one of history's darkest hours, and certainly is a presage to the tribulation period.
Now, quickly, I want to point out, we're not talking about astrology. We're talking about God's witness in the stars. And J.R., there's a phenomenal statement in the book of Job, chapter 26, where Job is talking about God's relationship to the visible heavens. Verse 11 says, "The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his reproof. He divideth the sea with his power, and by his understanding he smiteth through the proud. By his spirit he hath garnished the heavens. His hand hath formed the crooked," or the fleeing serpent. "Lo, these are the parts of his ways, but how little a portion is heard of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand?" J.R., there's one statement here that's phenomenal.
Wow.
By his spirit, he hath garnished the heavens. Now, if you look at this in the Hebrew, this means that he's designed the...
God designed the heavens.
The structure.
God designed the planets and their message.
That's right. And in verse 14, it says, "Lo, these are parts of his ways." A way is a pathway. We would call it the ecliptic. The parts are the divisions of the ecliptic, and those are 12 divisions, and they have been ever since time immemorial. So Job acknowledges here that God designed the asterisms, the configurations of the stars, and these are the parts of his ways. In other words, the division called Mazarot, in modern days we call it the Zodiac, are the parts of his ways.
Tells his plan.
His plan?
That's his message.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to understand that the 12 constellations are divided into a 3-act play. The first act begins with Bethlehem, the first advent of Christ. Then we come to the church age, the dispensation of grace, with the fish, of course, being the primary signs of that period. And then the third act begins with Taurus through Leo, and this is the end of days, the second coming of Christ, the final judgment. In fact, it is called the Day of the Lord by Joseph Size, who wrote the book on the Gospel in the Stars in 1882. This is amazing that he lays all of this message, the ancient message that Job talked about, the 12 parts of God's ways, God's plan of the ages.
There's literally no denying that there is a gospel message in the stars. Virtually everything you see there has to do with the redemptive plan. Now, as we began talking about this last week, we were talking about the Ram, the mythical beast called unicorn, or as he is seen in the stars, Taurus the bull. JR, you might mention again how this symbolizes judgment and where we're going from here.
We are entering into Taurus, 1941, and again this month, both in the month of May. The planets aligning or grouping together around the sun, and we are beginning then the trek through the final 4 constellations and their sidereal side pieces. The interesting thing about it is, Gary, Job was written by a Gentile, or is the story of a Gentile who lived contemporary with Jacob and Esau, and before Esau established his kingdom called the Kingdom of Edom. This land called the Land of Uz, or UZ, or Uz, whatever depends on whether you're from Texas or the rest of the world is how you pronounce it. But the interesting thing is, this land is a region south of Edom, beginning west of the Arabian Desert and extending all the way across the desert, across northern Arabia, southern Iraq, over to Chaldea or Kuwait, we might say.
Yeah, and in that day, by the way, it was very fertile land. And there's still parts of it today that are very pleasant land. There's a lot of agriculture as you move east toward the Mesopotamian areas. And Job was a wealthy man who apparently knew nothing of the Abrahamic covenant at all. He was a Gentile. He apparently had not heard of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is singled out for special treatment by the Lord and by Satan. He becomes the drama of a man under test, or shall we say a chosen vessel being tested of the Lord, type of Israel.
In Job's day, there was no Genesis, there was no Bible written on papyrus or stone or in any way for mankind. The only Bible Job had was above at night when he saw the 12 constellations and their 36 sidereal side pieces.
Now, as we read last week in Job 38, 31 and 30, the Lord says to him, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth, that is a zodiac, in his season? Canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons?" And we pointed out in our last broadcast, this is talking about the portion of the sky typified by Taurus the bull.
Yes. And the interesting thing about Arcturus there is that it appears to be a reference to Boates, the shepherd, who is one of the 3 decans of Virgo. In other words, this scripture specifies that Arcturus is actually the same seed of the woman that was born 2,000 years ago. He's coming back in Taurus.
In Taurus.
Now, Arcturus is a star in the knee of Boates, and it refers, the very name says, he is the keeper of Arctos. And Arctos is the constellation today known as the Big Dipper, and the ancient zodiacs known as Ursa Major, or the bear, the big bear. But before it was a bear, it was a sheepfold, and so it's a typical of heaven. And it's one of the three sidereal side pieces to Cancer, which speaks of the resurrection. So we have all of these constellations together with a tremendous message here from the book of Job. And of course, the interesting thing is that all these planets are lining up, both in 1941 in May and again in May today. We'll give you more of the picture in just a moment. Sky and Telescope magazine gives a list of 10 times in history that are significant for the grouping of the planets around the sun. And the first one, of course, was in 1953 BC, and that is called the Mandate of Heaven. So all 10 of these appear to be the Mandate of Heaven. The one this month in May of the year 2000 is number 9. The 10th and final grouping listed here will come in 40 years. In the year 2040, and it occurs in Virgo the Virgin with the new moon. And the fascinating thing is the new moon of September 8th in the year 2040 is Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of a Jewish year. And that is this is 5760. That would be the year 5800. Bingo.
Ooh, my.
Amazing.
It is amazing. And in case you think we're stepping a little out of bounds here, I want to remind you that the book of Job is full of references to God's interaction with the visible heavens. Job 9:7, he commands the sun, it riseth not. Sealeth up the stars, which alone spreadeth out the heavens, and treadeth upon the waves of the sea, which maketh Arcturus and Orion, Pleiades, and the chambers of the south. Now the chambers of the south here is the constellation Scorpio. And he says, which doeth great things past finding out, and yea, and wonders without number. Clearly, Job linked events on the face of planet Earth with events that were written in the stars. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. And you know, there's a story there, tremendous story there in the constellations you have listed, because Arcturus is the Lord Jesus Christ. He is the shepherd, the keeper of the sheepfold. Mm-hmm. And the sheepfold, of course, is a constellation in Cancer, and that speaks of resurrection. Gemini, what has been called the twin boys, is actually in the ancient Dendera Zodiac, a man and his wife. That's Arcturus and the Pleiades, basically. The Pleiades is the congregation of the judge. And so he's saying, basically, the rapture is taking place there.
And he mentions Orion, the great warrior, who carries the head of a lion. And this is a picture of Christ coming back in judgment.
Yes.
So, again, those great things past finding out are given to Job by God. We have, it's amazing to me, in chapter 39, there's a long discourse on the unicorn. Chapter 39:9, will the unicorn be willing to serve thee or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow? Now that band of the unicorn we know as the belt in Orion. And this is a clear reference to the heavens and to the judge. And by the way, there cannot be any mistaking it. And
so rather than being a one-horned mythological creature, it was actually a gigantic ox, nearly the size of an elephant, according to Caesar, who wrote in his histories of his wars, one of the Caesars of Rome, centuries ago. And they've actually found remains, according to the 19th century Joseph Seiss, remains of this ox in northern Palestine.
And we read a moment ago, Job 26:13, by his spirit he hath garnished the heavens, his hand formed the crooked or the fleeing serpent, which is a reference to Hydra. So here we have a reference to the constellation Hydra, the fleeing serpent.
Amazing, isn't it? Because that's the final constellation. When we see Leo the lion jumping on Hydra, destroying him, we have two other constellations that are part of Leo. Not only Hydra tells the story of Leo, but Corvus the bird tells the story of Leo, the bird eating the flesh of Hydra, and then a bowl of wrath being poured out upon Hydra. That's the 7 vials of wrath of Revelation and the battle of Armageddon, when the birds come in chapter 19 of Revelation to eat the flesh of the slain on the battlefields of Armageddon. It's all there, isn't it, Gary?
It's all there. And when the Lord speaks to Job, these are famous words, by the way. Job 38:4, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding. Who laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest it? Who stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Who laid the cornerstone thereof? Now, this is all talking about the creation of the earth, but the next verse, it tells it all. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Here the associations of the stars linked with the lines laid out upon the earth, clearly linking heavenly signs with earthly events once again.
Now, notice the picture of Boaz. He has a sickle in his hand. This is the sickle of the harvester, the reaper. And of course, the sickle is also the symbol of Saturn. This month, Saturn enters into Taurus. 7 years later, down the road, in September of the year 2007, Saturn with its sickle will have gone through Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, and into Leo to meet with Regulus in a conjunction on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, in September of the year 2007. And Regulus is in the handle of a sickle that goes up and through the head and out the mouth of Leo the lion. And Gary, so the story of the sickle of Boaz and Saturn and Leo tells the story of the second coming of Christ in judgment upon the earth. And I want to read to you from Revelation chapter 14, because this is the story of 2 sickles. And we see Christ, who is sitting upon the clouds of glory, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, in his hand a sharp sickle. This is Arcturus. This is Boaz with the sickle in his hand, and I think in the form of Saturn. And another angel, and by the way, Saturn has been called the Grim Reaper because of that sickle. And Saturn is the one from which the word Saturday comes. That's the 7th millennium, the day of the Lord. So it all fits in the ancient star charts. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time for thee is come for thee to reap, and the harvest of the earth is ripe. And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. And then another angel came out of the temple, which was in heaven, having a sharp sickle. Here's the second sickle. And this sickle had power over fire, and cried with a loud voice to him with a sharp sickle, saying, thrust in thy sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth. Her grapes are fully ripe. This sounds like a period of time here in the 7-year tribulation period. And when this sickle is thrust in, the grapes, or that is the blood that comes out of this, is called the great winepress of the wrath of God. This is Armageddon.
Now, if there is a significance then to the May roughly 5th through 17th of the year 2000 grouping of the planets, it is that this grouping takes place in Taurus, called Re'em, or in the Old Testament it's called the unicorn. Job was told by the Lord that this is a symbol of God's judgment. And within the symbol of the unicorn, we find several subsets of symbols. For example, Orion, the mighty hunter, the coming one. Yes. And we find Eridanus, the river, which has been called the river of fire, similar to the fire that comes forth from the throne of God, fiery judgment. Yeah. We find a lot of symbols of judgment coming out of the sign of Taurus.
In the 7th chapter of Daniel, it's called a fiery stream. Mm-hmm. This stream is the river. It's the same constellation, and that's when God sits down upon his throne and the judgment is set and the books are opened. Open Act 3.
And I want you to hear what Joseph Seiss wrote in 1882. He said, although the present church period will have ended before the promised seed of the woman takes on the character described in the text and in these signs, the probation will not have entirely ended. What he's saying there is that before this happens, the church will be taken out, but those remaining will not lose their chance to receive salvation. He believed in a pre-tribulation rapture of the church.
And it appears to be in the Pleiades, those 7 sisters that sit on the shoulder of Taurus. Say, this is really a fascinating time. Now, we cannot tell you that this is the mandate of heaven, but we can say it certainly looks like it. That which started when Abraham was 99 years old back on February 26, 1953 BC is being played out in 10 groupings, and we are in group number 9 this month. We'll be back in just a moment.